Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're traveling into a world where survival wasn't about breaking the law. It was about being broken by the world around you. A world where your job description didn't come with benefits or even dignity, but with danger, dirt, and a very real expiration date. So before you settle in, dim the lights, grab something warm to sip on, and maybe close your eyes for a moment. Because we're about to slip into the life of someone who never dreamed of fame or fortune, only a full belly and maybe, just maybe, not being chased out of town before breakfast. Imagine waking up in a cold, smoky hut in medieval Europe. The fire's out. Your stomach growls louder than the rooster, and your legs are the only part of you with any value. There's no trade to your name, no land to till, no coins clinking in your pocket. What you do have is the ability to run, climb, and duck faster than the local reeve can yell, "Thief!" But let's be real. No one wanted this life. It wasn't rebellion, and it sure as hell wasn't glamorous. It was the back-alley career path of desperation. A last resort. You didn't aspire to steal. You were shoved into it by a world that closed all the honest doors first. Jobs back then weren't just scarce, they were nearly impossible to survive. And the ones you could get, soul-numbing. Picture yourself working sunrise to moonrise, smashing rocks or reeking of fermented grain from brewing vats, only to be handed a crust of stale bread and a cold stare at the end of the day. All that if you were lucky enough to have a boss who paid you in anything besides empty promises or religious guilt. So it's no surprise that some folks, worn down to the bone, turned to theft. Not because they were wicked or cunning, but because it was either that or fade away from hunger and shame. But here's the brutal irony. It didn't take much to get branded a criminal. Stealing? That wasn't just about breaking into a granary. Pick up a bruised apple from a muddy street that might have rolled off a cart. Theft. Chase after your own wayward chicken only to crash into someone's backyard. Trespass. Suddenly, you're the talk of the town, and not in a good way. And once the whispers started, they never stopped. Communities didn't forgive easily. One wrong move and you'd be labeled, not in ink or parchment, but in stories passed around dinner tables, carried from ear to ear like curses. You weren't just that guy who grabbed a loaf once. You became the thief. The kind mothers warned their kids about, the kind the priest side-eyed during Sunday prayers. Let's say you decided to lean into that title, wear the night like a cloak, and move with purpose. You find a rag to tie around your face, not because it helps, but because you've seen one or two real bandits do it, and it makes you feel slightly more professional in your misfortune. You wait for darkness, you listen for silence, and then you go hunting, only to realize there's nothing to hunt. See, nobody had anything. Not the kind of nothing where you skip dessert. The kind where dessert never existed. People didn't have pockets full of coin. They had empty bellies and borrowed cloaks. The average villager lived in a home held together by mud, sticks, and spit. Maybe they owned a rusty spoon or two, some ragged clothes, and a goat that doubled as both income and company. You weren't robbing treasure chests. You were raiding soup pots, and the few who did have wealth, they were surrounded by more iron and muscle than you could dream of. Nobles didn't stroll through town with gold dripping from their fingers. They rode with guards who sharpened their swords just for fun. Even the idea of touching a noble's hat without permission could land you in a ditch. Or worse, the town square with half your teeth missing and a branding iron waiting. Maybe you thought about churches next. Chalices, candles, crosses of silver. But the church wasn't as dumb as it looked. Locked doors, judgmental eyes, and the very real threat of divine wrath hung in the air like incense. One wrong move and the whole village knew by midday. Plus, a few angels probably marked you for a lightning bolt later in the week. You didn't even have to believe in curses to feel their weight dragging behind you. Graveyards? Don't even go there. Literally. Medieval cemeteries weren't neat rows of marble and silence. They were chaos, bones, rocks, moles, and the very real chance you'd spend half the night digging only to discover someone's compost pile. And if word got out that you tampered with the dead, you were no longer just a thief. You were a freak, a suspected necromancer, a soul snatcher, and suddenly the local witch hunting committee started watching you a little too closely. Even if you could find something worth stealing, you had to move like a ghost, quiet, fast, invisible. That was the dream. The reality, you smelled like mildew and fear. Hygiene wasn't just rare, it was practically illegal. No soap, no showers, no deodorant. Just layers of filth soaked into the one outfit you owned, which had probably seen more nights in a ditch than you'd like to admit. People didn't hear you coming. They smelled you from across the marketplace. Your clothes clung to you like a second, smellier skin. Days spent crouched behind pig pens or hiding under carts meant every fiber was infused with barnyard memories. You became a walking nose assault. Even your sweat gave up trying to be subtle. You didn't need dogs to track you. Your own stench left a trail. And medieval towns, not exactly the best places to blend in. Crowds were dirty, sure, but even in a sea of unwashed faces, you stood out. You didn't look like someone tired from work. You looked like someone who hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, and had possibly been rolled down a hill for sport. And then came the dogs. Not the friendly kind. These weren't golden retrievers wagging their tails. These were wiry, half-starved monsters named things like Fang, Mutt, or Doom. They didn't bark because they hated you. They barked because they knew you were a problem. One sniff and it was over. They didn't need training. Your entire existence was offensive enough. Every house, every alley, every tavern had a canine snitch waiting for your footsteps, barking, snarling, charging straight at you like a furry missile of justice. They didn't even need a reason. Sneeze near a pantry? Bark. Breathe too close to a turnip cart? Bark. Suddenly, the entire village orchestra is awake, and you're the soloist sprinting out of key. Worse still, dogs remembered. You could skip town for weeks and come back, and that same mutt would still be waiting, still mad, still ready. You weren't just a thief. You were a chew toy in boots, and if that didn't stop you, the people would. Because in medieval towns, chasing criminals wasn't a job. It was sport. Everyone joined in. Kids, bakers, drunks, widows with brooms. If the dog barked, the town listened, and they didn't ask questions. You were guilty the second the hound howled. But let's say, just say, you managed to slip past the mutts, the muck, the mobs. You creep up to a house. No lock on the door. Jackpot, right, wrong. That's just where the next nightmare begins. So, there you are, standing in front of a medieval door. No lock, no guard, nothing but a crooked slab of wood held together by rusted nails and the fading hope of privacy. It looks like an invitation. It feels like opportunity, but it isn't. The absence of a lock didn't mean trust. It meant traps. You reach for the door, slow, deliberate, careful not to rattle the hinges. But the moment your fingers graze the handle, the wood groans louder than a choir of ghosts. It's not a door, it's an alarm system built out of squeaks and resentment. And that's just the beginning. Step inside, and you're greeted by a symphony of sabotage. A string of bells hangs just past the frame. Crude, but devastating. One jingle, and the whole house jolts awake like a startled hornet nest. Now the baby's crying, the dog's howling, and someone's already yelling for a pitchfork. Some homes had even more creativity. A bucket of water perched above the door, ready to baptize you in shame. Floors scattered with dry twigs that snapped like breaking bones, and if you stumbled into the wrong farmhouse, you might be welcomed by the world's angriest goose, hissing like a demon and charging with the fury of a feathered berserker. That's right, geese, the unspoken guardians of the medieval world. Forget your Hollywood-trained guard dogs. A goose had no patience, no fear, and no warning. They shrieked, flapped, and lunged with the energy of an insulted dragon. Once that courtyard came alive with wings and wailing, your element of surprise was gone. You weren't a thief anymore. You were entertainment. And if, by some unholy miracle, you got past the poultry, the improvised alarms, and the house that sounded like it was built entirely out of haunted floorboards, you still had to deal with the people inside. Because in the Middle Ages, nobody slept deeply. They didn't trust the night, and for good reason. Bandits, wolves, plague, tax collectors. Danger crept in with the darkness. So people slept in shifts, one ear open, one hand clutching something sharp. And I'm not talking about shiny swords or elegant daggers. I'm talking fireplace pokers, sharpened sticks, soup ladles with attitude. Anything that could leave a dent in someone's skull was fair game. Even the spoons were suspiciously pointy. Now imagine trying to sneak through that. You're tiptoeing around a straw mat, trying not to trip over someone's cousin or the family butter churn, when suddenly, snap, a floorboard creaks. Not a loud creak, just enough to raise eyebrows, and in that instant, someone's already halfway up, brandishing a rolling pin like it's Excalibur. See, medieval homes weren't houses in the modern sense. They were cramped, one-room survival bunkers packed with people, animals, and dreams that smelled vaguely of turnips. There was no hallway to disappear down, no upstairs to flee to, no place to hide except maybe behind the family goat. And he wasn't interested in helping. Even if nobody saw you, they'd hear you, or smell you, or dream about you. Yes, seriously. In a world where the mind and body were always half awake, even a murmured word in a dream could blow your cover. There are stories, real ones, of thieves getting caught because someone shouted in their sleep, accusing them mid-heist, and if you thought getting caught meant a stern warning and a trip to the local dungeon, think again. The punishment wasn't subtle, it wasn't quiet, it was public, painful, and designed to stick with you. Literally. First, they branded you, not metaphorically. I'm talking glowing hot iron to the flesh, stamped like cattle. Maybe it was a letter, a T for thief, a V for vagabond, or just a nice sizzling reminder of your bad decision-making. It didn't matter what the letter meant. What mattered was that it marked you forever. You couldn't wash it off. You couldn't hide it, and everyone knew what it meant. Jobs? Gone. Trust? Gone. You were now the guy with a walking billboard of shame on your face. And sometimes, the people in charge weren't even good at it. The local blacksmith might have shaky hands. The village priest might be experimenting. What should have been a tea might end up looking like a burnt potato. Either way, your face was ruined, and your reputation went with it. But if that was your first offense, consider yourself lucky. If you were caught again, the punishments got worse. Fingers chopped, hair shaved in humiliating patterns. Pieces of your identity, your ability to hold tools, to run, to blend in, stripped away piece by piece. It was a medieval version of cancellation, but with blood. And then came the mob. Because before you even got to trial, if you ever got that far, there was the community. The same people who smiled at you during market days now stared with suspicion. And if something went missing, if someone's last onion vanished or a pair of shoes wandered off, the finger always pointed to you. Trial by law was optional. Trial by crowd was guaranteed. The process was simple. Someone shouted, "That's him!" And that was it. Marjorie from down the road, who once caught you looking weirdly at her geese, now had a story to tell. The kids joined in because drama is fun. And suddenly, you're being pelted with turnips, shoes, and, if you're truly unlucky, an entire goat. Forget justice. This was catharsis. And if, after all that, you weren't dead, congratulations. You now earned a new spot. In the stocks. Out in the open, limbs locked in place, dignity leaking out like yesterday's stew. Rain, snow, bird droppings, it didn't matter. You were a display, a lesson, a walking punchline, and the whole village was invited to join the show. People threw things, they laughed, they brought their kids. You were the evening entertainment, no intermission, no refund, and through all of it, you stayed there. Cold, cramped, hungry, wondering if the turnip to the face was going to be the worst part of your week. You thought stealing bread would solve your problems. But all it did was feed a machine built to crush the hungry, humiliate the desperate, and punish the unlucky. And you weren't even at the worst part yet. So there you are, locked in the stocks, rain crawling down your spine, the crowd enjoying their personal theater production of The Idiot Who Took a Sausage. You can't move. You can't hide. Your ankles throb, your back screams, and someone's throwing a particularly moldy cabbage with the precision of a trained archer. But that's just the warm-up. Because when the crowd gets bored of mocking and the smell of manure becomes yesterday's joke, the authorities step in. And now it's time for a proper punishment. One with rope, one with blood, one with an audience that didn't come for mercy. Flogging. You're dragged to the town square, arms tied to a splintered post, and stripped to the waist, though your shirt was probably halfway shredded already. The whip comes out, not some fancy braided leather like in the stories, but something cruder, a twisted length of hide, maybe with knots, maybe with bone or metal at the ends, designed not just to strike, but to tear. You hear the whistle before the pain. The first lash lands and it burns, but worse, it echoes. People murmur, some cheer. A few wince and look away, but no one stops it. Because this isn't just justice, it's a lesson, and your body is the blackboard. They don't count carefully. Maybe it's 5 lashes, maybe 10, maybe 20, depending on how generous or bitter the enforcer is feeling. If you faint, they don't stop. They just pause long enough to splash you with cold water and start again. It's not personal, it's policy. And if you think that was the worst of it, you're still living in the realm of hope. Because sometimes they skip the whipping. Sometimes they go straight to the grand finale, the gallows. See, executions weren't rare, private or solemn. They were scheduled events, public, planned, and weirdly festive. Market day. Perfect. Nothing like buying a few onions and watching someone swing before lunch. People brought their kids. Vendors showed up with snacks. A good hanging could draw a crowd like a puppet show, only with less singing and more nervous sweating. You didn't just get sentenced and disappear into the night. No, you were announced. Maybe on Monday, maybe earlier. And then you waited. Days, sometimes longer. Listening to the guards joke about your last words. Watching the scaffold being built piece by piece. Like a grim stage rising for your final scene. When the day came, the town showed up early. They didn't hate you exactly. Most didn't even know your name. But they knew the story. Thief, criminal, scourge. The rope was there to remind them that order still meant something, even if justice rarely did. And when they finally slipped the noose over your head, there were no speeches, no chance for redemption. Maybe the priest mumbled something. Maybe the executioner let you speak. But mostly, it was business. The trap door opened. The air left your lungs. And if the rope was new or poorly tied, well, then the whole thing got awkward. You didn't die right away. You twitched, kicked, struggled. A final dance in front of an audience that sipped ale and whispered, should have stuck to farming. Sometimes your body stayed there for hours. Days. A warning sign strung up by the neck. Steal a chicken, meet the crows. It didn't matter who you were or why you did it. What mattered was the message. And if you managed somehow to survive this long without being hanged or beaten or branded into oblivion, if you were lucky enough, clever enough, or just pitiful enough to limp out of town alive, Congratulations. You're now a professional fugitive. You disappear into the woods, into the ruins, into the slums of a city where no one knows your name. Yet, you might still steal, still hustle, still sleep under carts and behind taverns, but now you do it with a scarred face and a target on your back. And don't count on some secret brotherhood of outlaws to help you. There's no Robin Hood waiting in the shadows to hand you a hood and a code of honor. What you'll find instead are men with missing teeth, dead eyes, and fists always curled. They don't trust you. You don't trust them. You all steal the same bread. There's no loyalty, no kinship. You might huddle together for warmth one night and wake up with your boots missing and your knife gone. These aren't friends. They're just competition with worse breath. If you do find a crew, they're more likely to sell you out than share a meal. One moment you're hiding from guards together, the next they're pointing at you and yelling, "There he is," because they want your bounty, or your boots, or just to be the one who didn't get caught this time. And hiding isn't easy. Ruined buildings aren't cozy. They're damp, broken, rat-infested nightmares. Your bed is a pile of straw that smells like mold and regret. Your meals. Whatever you can steal, catch, or trade from someone even more desperate. Sometimes you're too injured to move. Other times you're too hungry to think. And always, you're too paranoid to sleep properly. You keep your knife close, you trust no one, and you pray the priest who saw you last week doesn't remember your face. Because if he does, and if the guards come sniffing, you won't get a trial. You'll get a chase. Again. And maybe this time, the rope won't be so kind. So you've survived the flogging, escaped the branding iron, dodged the gallows, maybe even slipped out of town with a bruised rib, a stolen loaf, and your name cursed in 3 dialects. You're not safe, but you're free. Sort of. Now what? You run. Not in a straight line. Not heroically. There's no music swelling behind you, no distant sunset to race toward. Just a muddy road, a crooked horizon, and your feet slapping through filth while someone's grandmother is chasing you with a broom, yelling words you don't understand, but definitely aren't blessings. Medieval towns weren't built for slick getaways. The streets were narrow, often barely wide enough for a cart. Everything curved and twisted like the town planner was drunk and angry with geometry. You tried to sprint but ended up ankle-deep in mud, dodging pigs, slipping on fish guts, and crashing into someone arguing with a monk. There was no clean exit, no alley that didn't smell like despair. Most of them weren't even alleys. They were just dead ends, cesspits, or surprise latrines. You'd think, "I'll hide here," only to realize you've just cornered yourself in a pile of communal sewage. And you're not alone. A rat stares up at you like, "Bold choice, friend." And let's not forget the footwear situation. If you were lucky, you had cracked leather shoes tied together with fraying string. If not, you were barefoot, feet cut open by sharp cobblestones, freezing from the damp and carrying a stench that could wake the dead. Try sprinting away from a butcher whose prize ham you just borrowed when every step feels like stepping on broken glass and betrayal. Even if you made it out of town, the countryside didn't welcome you. The open fields left you exposed. Forests, though better for hiding, were filled with others just like you. Or worse. Men who didn't just steal. They took. And if you stumbled in with a bloodied face and a stolen pie, they wouldn't offer help. They'd offer to relieve you of the pie and your teeth. Because here's the twist. In this world, other thieves weren't your allies. They were rivals, hungry, paranoid, and dangerous. You weren't joining a band of merry men. You were crashing into a den of broken promises and sharper knives. The kind of people who'd rob you blind one night and pretend to cry at your funeral the next, just long enough to check your pockets. If you did manage to keep the goods and lie low, you had to find shelter. Not a house, not even a barn. Just somewhere out of sight, a ruined wall, an abandoned well, the hollow under a collapsed tree. somewhere to sleep lightly and breathe quieter. But even sleep was a risk. You might wake to find your shoes missing, or your cloak, or your friend from last night trying to stab you over a half-rotten turnip. And that's if you weren't caught again, because the townsfolk didn't forget. Guards talked. Merchants described you in detail. Children remembered. The one with the limp and the ugly scarf. Word traveled faster than you could run, and medieval justice didn't need evidence. All it needed was a memory and a pitchfork. And then came the truly grim realization. There was no retirement, no cozy cottage at the edge of the woods where old thieves went to whittle sticks and tell stories. You didn't get to grow old. If you were lucky, you got to grow invisible, slowly starving, begging for crusts, hiding behind layers of ragged anonymity. If not, you got remembered only as a cautionary tale and a stain on someone's wall. Some tried to start over. They'd find a new town, try to work honestly. Maybe as a porter, a ditch digger, or a beggar, anything that didn't require stealing. But the moment someone asked, "Where are you from?" or spotted the faded scar from the brand on your arm, it was over. No one hired a known thief, and no one forgot a face that once ruined a festival by stealing the celebrant's cheese wheel. Others turned informant. They ratted out their own kind, trading secrets for coins or safety. But that game didn't last long. The moment someone found out, you weren't just a thief anymore. You were a traitor, and that was worse. Much worse. Because a thief might get flogged, but a snitch got buried. So you kept running, kept hiding, kept stealing, not because it was fun, but because it was the only thing left. And the world? It didn't change. It kept spinning in its muddy, merciless way. The rich stayed rich, the poor stayed hungry. And thieves? Thieves just kept dying, quietly, messily, forgotten in a ditch or remembered only by the smell they left behind. In the end, the medieval thief wasn't a villain or a hero or even a character in a story worth telling. He was a shadow in the alley, a name whispered under breath, a lesson carved into flesh, proof that in a world built on survival, some people were born to lose and taught to run. So let's say you've pulled off the impossible. You didn't get caught, at least not yet. You've ducked into some half-burnt tavern ruin, clutching your prize, maybe a coin pouch with 3 pennies and a roasted duck someone was foolish enough to leave unattended. You chew fast, you think faster, and for a split second, you feel like you've won. But the truth? There's no winning, not really, because even if you managed to make a name for yourself, Successful Thief was not a title that aged well. There was no Hall of Fame, no cozy inn with your name on a plaque, no drinking songs that ended in anything but gallows. What you had now was attention, and in the medieval underworld, attention was fatal. See, you weren't the only one trying to survive. Every ruined stable, every empty alley was home to others like you. Desperate, broke, mean. And the longer you stuck around, the more they noticed. That duck you just stole? Someone else wanted it too. And maybe they don't care about honor or fairness or even effort. Maybe they just care that you're alive and eating and they're not. There was no code, no band of thieves. Just a shattered community of scroungers willing to slit each other's throats for the chance to lick a soup bowl. Even if you found a crew, it wasn't loyalty that held it together. It was hunger. The moment you had something worth stealing, your own allies became your predators. They'd smile over your fire one night and rob you blind while you slept. Or worse, wake you with a knife to the throat and a whisper of, "Don't take it personal." But the danger didn't just come from other thieves. The real threat, the noise, the fights, the drunken shouting, the dumb bragging that turned every street corner into a confession booth. You'd lie low for days, hiding in shadows, and one idiot with a stolen spoon and a loud mouth would get dragged off screaming and name every person he'd ever shared a loaf with, including you and your cousin and probably your goat. The truth was, It wasn't hard to find a thief. It was hard to stay one and keep breathing. And if, by some miracle, you wanted out, if you thought you'd done enough, bled enough, and decided to go straight, good luck. You were still branded, still infamous, still missing teeth, dignity, and a reason anyone should trust you. You'd walk into a town, ask for work, and be met with narrowed eyes and hands inching toward broomsticks. Even if they didn't recognize your face, your story followed you like a shadow with a louder voice. "Used to be a thief," they'd whisper. "I heard he robbed a monk, or a midwife, or a goose farm, depending on who's telling it." The details changed. The outcome didn't. You weren't welcome, anywhere. Some tried begging, but begging in a medieval town wasn't as easy as sitting on a corner and rattling a cup. You needed a permit. Yes, really. A scrap of parchment that said, in fancy letters, "This person is allowed to be pitiful here." Without it, you weren't a beggar. You were a loitering vagrant, another criminal, just slower and sadder. Some tried ratting, becoming informants, snitches. They'd trade names for protection, tell the guards where the others hid. It might buy you a few coins and a few days of breathing easy, but it was like swimming in shark-infested waters with your pockets full of blood. The moment someone found out, that was it. You weren't just a thief anymore. You were a traitor, and every broken man in the gutter wanted a piece of you. Others tried joining mercenary bands. Men hired to swing swords for someone else's war. It sounded better than starving, until you realized that being a mercenary just meant dying somewhere farther away, and probably for a cause you didn't understand. Led by men who barely knew your name. Some ran to the forests, tried to become folklore, vanish into trees and live off berries and legend. Maybe you imagined yourself as a mysterious outlaw, watching the world from behind the trees, daring and free. But most just died, quietly, in ditches, alone, with nothing but a half-rotted cloak and a name nobody said anymore. Because that was the real story of crime in the medieval world. It wasn't clever, it wasn't exciting, it wasn't a game. It was a slow, painful spiral into a hole that got darker with every choice. And it always started the same way, with someone too poor to eat, too tired to work, and just desperate enough to reach for what wasn't theirs. It began with good intentions, or so they said. In the early 1800s, Britain was a country coming apart and pulling itself together all at once. The machines had arrived. Cities swelled with smoke and soot. People flooded into towns like Manchester and London in search of work and hope, and mostly found neither. Among the rising clamor of factory bells and grinding gears came something else. Something society didn't like to talk about. Madness, or at least what they called madness. Before this era, those who didn't quite fit, the confused, the grieving, the strange, were hidden. Behind doors, under roofs, locked away in cellars or chained to walls in private madhouses run by men with more keys than ethics. The poor ended up in workhouses, the unlucky in prisons, and everyone else just whispered about the neighbor who talked to himself or stared too long out the window. But that wasn't sustainable anymore. The cities were too full, the streets too crowded, and the chaos too visible. Enter the reformers. People like William Tuke, a Quaker in York, who dared to imagine something different. He spoke of kindness, of gardens, of air and light. Not chains, but care. Not beatings, but belief in recovery. It was radical, it was humane, and for a moment it looked like a revolution. And then came the system. In 1808, Parliament passed the County Asylums Act. Suddenly, it wasn't just moralists talking about the mentally ill. It was the government. Tax-funded asylums began springing up across England and Wales like stone mushrooms, towering institutions meant to treat and contain. And that was the problem. The and. Because you could only have one or the other. treatment or containment, hope or efficiency. And as the years rolled on, the hope rotted. These new public asylums, in theory, were for those suffering from mental illness. In practice, they became dumping grounds for the inconvenient, the loud, the poor, the sad, the opinionated, the fragile, the different, unmarried women with too much emotion. In they went, men who drank too much, gone. Epileptics, widows, orphans, daydreamers, anyone who made Victorian society uncomfortable found themselves behind those doors. And once you were in, getting out was another story. The buildings were massive, intimidating, Gothic in style, fortress-like in spirit. From the outside, they looked like places where minds might be healed. From the inside, they were cold, echoing tombs where names turned into numbers and humanity slipped away. The diagnoses: vague, pseudo-scientific, often deeply moral. A woman who cried too long after her child died might be labeled hysterical. A man who didn't work enough might be said to suffer from melancholia. There were no scans, no tests, only observation and opinion and paperwork written in ink and finality. And once labeled, that label stuck like pitch. You weren't sad, you were mad, you weren't struggling, you were dangerous. And now, for your safety, and the public's, you would be removed. Removed from your home, from your family, from your identity. Replaced with a bed in a ward with 30 others. Replaced with silence. The asylums, over time, grew bloated. Built for dozens, they held hundreds, thousands. The staff thinned. The resources dwindled. The dream of moral therapy collapsed beneath the weight of reality. Kindness was replaced with protocol. Flowers with locks. Empathy with cold. Steel beds bolted to the floor, and those who entered found that madness wasn't something they brought with them. It was something they caught, because being treated like an animal for long enough can make you behave like one. And outside, no one noticed. Or maybe they just didn't want to. Once inside, the asylum didn't just hold your body. It rewrote your story. You weren't a man who had fallen on hard times. You weren't a woman shattered by grief or a child who struggled to learn. You were now a patient. And that word, patient, carried a new meaning in the Victorian era. It meant silent, it meant compliant, it meant forgotten. Treatment, as they called it, didn't resemble healing. Not in the way we think of it. There were no therapy sessions, no understanding of trauma or neurological imbalance. Medicine, if you could even call it that, was built not around recovery, but obedience. And so, healing began with force. Cold water immersion was a favorite. A patient screaming from voices only they could hear might be dragged to a tub of icy water and plunged beneath. Not for a minute. For hours. Bound, shivering, silent. The theory said cold would shock the madness out. The reality was trauma layered atop trauma, until nothing was left but numbness. Another marvel of 19th century science. The tranquilizer chair, a tall, intimidating thing, built not for comfort, but compliance. You were strapped in, arms, legs, even your head. Sometimes blindfolded. Sometimes a box was placed over your entire face, blocking sight and sound. Not because you posed a threat, but because your suffering made others uncomfortable. And silence was easier than sympathy. Electricity crept in soon after. Long before it became refined or safe, early doctors experimented with crude devices, convinced they could stimulate sanity into submission. Wires attached to temples, jolts delivered to limbs. Most patients didn't scream. Not because it didn't hurt, but because they learned early that screaming only led to more. And if the machines didn't work, they reached for older tools, leeches, bloodletting, laxatives. The belief was that madness lived in the blood, in the bowels, in the imbalance of bodily fluids. So out with it. Drain it. Cleanse it. Purge it. It didn't matter if you fainted, if you vomited, if you begged for it to stop. Cleanliness, they said, was next to sanity. For women, the horror went deeper. Hysteria, the great catch-all diagnosis, became a sentence for any woman who expressed anger, sadness, desire, or simply refused to play the quiet wife. Doctors treated it with restraint, yes, but also with surgeries. Forced celibacy, even genital mutilation masquerading as cure. Some women were subjected to forced relief, procedures so invasive and degrading that modernaires struggle to comprehend they were ever done in the name of medicine. And yet they were. Sedatives became another favorite. Chloral hydrate, laudanum, opiates. Patients were dosed not to soothe, but to silence. One nurse for every 50 patients. Better to drug them all into stillness than attempt anything like care. You didn't sleep because you were comforted. You slept because the alternative was panic, and they preferred the quiet. Kindness, when it happened, was an accident. A brief, flickering moment when a junior attendant looked you in the eye and remembered you were human. But those moments passed. They always passed. Because the system wasn't built to save you, it was built to contain you. You could scream, but no one listened. You could get better and still not leave.
Because once the world believed you were mad, even your sanity looked suspicious. You didn't need to read a patient record to know what an asylum was built for. You just had to look at it. From a distance, they looked like palaces. Grand entrances, symmetrical wings, vast windows, all wrapped in stone that gleamed when it rained. But the closer you got, the more the illusion fell apart. Because these buildings weren't homes. They were machines, designed not with comfort in mind but containment. The Victorian asylum was a monument to order. Every brick, every hallway, every iron bolt had a purpose, and that purpose was control. Inside, everything was categorized. Men on one side, women on the other, the quiet in the center. The loud shoved toward the far wings where their screams couldn't interrupt polite conversation. You were sorted not by need, but by how much trouble they thought you'd be. Windows were high and narrow, not for sunlight but surveillance. You couldn't see out, but the staff could see in. Doors locked from the outside always. Furniture was nailed down. Walls were bare. The idea was to strip away stimulation. But in reality, it stripped away identity. You didn't decorate your space. You didn't shape it. You simply existed in it, like an animal in a pen that had forgotten what grass felt like. At the heart of many asylums stood the superintendent's office, a room with windows that overlooked everything, a perch for the one in charge to monitor the patients without ever stepping among them. It was a living panopticon. You never knew when you were being watched, so you always behaved as if you were. Even the gardens weren't innocent. Lush, green, deceptively peaceful. Patients were marched through them in organized groups, not for therapy but for structure. Walking in circles under supervision. No talking. No touching. Just the illusion of leisure performed like a ritual. The flowers weren't there to be admired. They were props in a scene designed to impress visiting benefactors. And then there were the airing courts. Small walled courtyards open to the sky but caged on all sides, where patients were given fresh air like inmates on a rooftop. Men walked clockwise, women counterclockwise. Talking was discouraged, expression was suspect. If someone laughed too loud, they were reported. If someone stared too long, they were restrained. The rules inside were endless. You needed permission to speak, to sit, to move, to write, even to use the toilet. Infractions were punished with isolation, silence, or worse. Solitary confinement wasn't reserved for violence. It was for disobedience, which could mean anything from shouting at night to asking for your family. And hope was dangerous. To express belief in your own recovery was considered delusional. To ask about leaving was grandiose. So patients learned to smile when told they were sick, and nod when told they were healing, even if neither was true. They learned to suppress everything: the pain, the rage, the memory of who they were before, because in the asylum being human was part of the diagnosis, and the only cure was silence. If you were a woman in Victorian Britain, the asylum was never far away, not in distance but in threat. It hung there behind every raised voice, every disobedient word, every tear that lasted too long. You didn't have to be mad. You just had to be inconvenient. Because in the 19th century, society didn't need much of an excuse to call a woman insane. A grieving widow who mourned too deeply, a wife who spoke back, a daughter who read too many novels, a woman who refused to marry, a woman who wanted to marry someone unacceptable. These weren't quirks, they were symptoms, and the cure: lock the door, lose the key. Husbands could commit their wives with 2 signatures, no trial, no hearing, no defense. The law didn't ask if she was dangerous, it asked if he was respected. That was enough. And what passed for diagnosis? That depended on who was doing the observing. Mood swings became hysteria, defiance became mania, menopause became madness. Your womb, they believed, could wander through your body, poisoning your mind. That was the medical theory: a wandering womb. It sounds absurd now, but it was gospel then, and women suffered for it. Sometimes it was subtle: a doctor suggesting rest, a husband arranging a holiday to a distant retreat. Other times it was brutal. You'd be pulled from your home, carried screaming, and declared unfit in the time it took to lace a corset. And once inside, you didn't lose just your freedom, you lost your voice, because the asylum wasn't just a place where women were hidden. It was where society's fears about women were locked away. Women who desired, who resisted, who dared to act outside the lines drawn for them. If a man wept for weeks, he was poetic. If a woman did, she was sick. If a man drank too much, he was troubled. If a woman did, she was a disgrace. If a man avoided marriage, he was independent. If a woman did, she was unstable. And the treatments, they were soaked in punishment. There were surgical solutions for hysteria, some so grotesque they barely belong in textbooks, let alone hospitals. Enforced celibacy, genital surgeries, and in darker corners, therapeutic acts performed under the guise of medicine, designed not to heal but to suppress, to control, to erase. Teenage girls were especially vulnerable. Too curious, too flirtatious, too outspoken, sent away for their own good. They entered as children and left, if they left, as shadows. The kind of silence that hangs behind the eyes. The kind of compliance that grows out of survival, not agreement. Mothers, too. Women shattered by miscarriage, by postpartum depression, by grief. There was no counseling, no support, just diagnosis. And then the long corridor, the heavy door, the whitewashed walls that stole your name. Inside, gender rules still ruled. Women were assigned sewing, cleaning, folding linens, not as therapy but as reinforcement, a way to remind them what they were supposed to be. Quiet, domestic, unseen. Even love could be punished. A woman who dared to fall in love with the wrong man, or worse, with another woman, could be declared unwell, her desire pathologized, her identity rewritten as disorder. And all of this, all of it happened while the world outside kept pretending it was for the best. She's just unwell, they'd whisper. She needs rest. She's in good hands. But behind those walls, the truth was louder than anyone dared say. The asylum didn't treat illness. It punished difference. And for Victorian women, difference was everywhere. And escape was rare. When most people imagined an asylum, they pictured a raving man in his 40s, wild-eyed and muttering into the wall. But that was only part of the truth, and maybe the most visible part. Because many of the quietest tragedies were too small to be noticed, or too old to be remembered. Children, the elderly, the forgotten bookends of a life that didn't fit neatly between sanity and sickness. Let's start with the children. Victorian society didn't understand childhood the way we do now. There was no widespread concept of neurodiversity, no language for learning disabilities, autism, or trauma. If a child didn't speak, didn't play, didn't follow instructions, They weren't seen as needing support. They were labeled feeble-minded, idiotic, defective. And so they were institutionalized. Entire wings of asylums were filled with children, some just 5 or 6 years old. Many were sent away by parents who had no means to care for them, or who simply didn't know what else to do. The shame of having a child who was wrong outweighed the maternal instinct to keep them home, and the system welcomed them. Another warm body to manage, another mouth to control. These children didn't learn. They were contained. They rocked in corners. They were sedated, restrained, punished for behaviors they couldn't explain and didn't understand. If they screamed, they were isolated. If they were quiet, they were ignored. Their names rarely made it into the records. Their voices never did. Some of them lived their entire lives behind those walls, from cradle to grave, never leaving the asylum grounds. No birthdays, no visitors, just routine, cold and silence. And at the other end of life, the elderly. A man in his 70s who begins to forget names. A woman who wanders at night muttering to herself. Today, we'd call it dementia. Back then, they called it senile insanity. And to the asylum they went. Old age, especially for the poor, was a curse in Victorian England. Workhouses were overcrowded and cruel. Families were often too poor to provide care. So when confusion set in, when someone began to forget how to cook or bathe or speak, they were labeled a burden and removed. Inside the asylum, the elderly weren't treated. They were warehoused, fed if someone remembered, cleaned if someone had time. Often they were left in dormitories where beds lined the walls like coffins. No privacy, no dignity, just the ticking of time and the slow fade of memory. And they died quietly, of cold, of infection, of loneliness. Records were lost. Graves were unmarked. Some were buried in mass plots behind the asylum itself, the earth turning over year after year, their names washed away with the seasons. No one came to visit. No one wrote to ask. Because once someone entered an asylum, child, adult, elder, the world outside didn't pause. It moved on. And for the young and the old, that was the final sentence. Not just removal, but erasure. For decades, the asylum stood unchallenged. Its stone walls and high gates weren't just physical barriers, they were moral ones. They allowed the world outside to look away, to pretend that those inside belonged there. That madness had been safely contained, that the system worked. But silence doesn't last forever. By the mid-19th century, the cracks began to show, small at first, then louder, then impossible to ignore. Scandals began to leak into the newspapers. Stories of patients found dead under suspicious circumstances. Women restrained for weeks at a time. Children locked in solitary. Cells that stank of rot and resignation. People started to whisper. And a few brave souls started to shout. One of the earliest voices came from across the Atlantic, Dorothea Dix, an American reformer who toured Britain's institutions and left horrified. She documented what she saw, not healing, not hope, but warehousing, abuse, neglect. She wasn't alone. In England, others followed. Louisa Lowe, John Percival, the son of a British prime minister and himself a former asylum inmate, who used his family name to expose the system from within. They wrote pamphlets, letters, testimonies. They risked ridicule. They risked being labeled unstable themselves. But the stories they told were impossible to dismiss. Women drugged to silence their protests. Patients chained for days. Sanitary conditions worse than prisons. Asylums more overcrowded than any workhouse. Some institutions became infamous. Hanwell, Colney Hatch. Massive, imposing buildings that housed thousands. And yet somehow, no one inside seemed to get better. In 1859, Parliament responded with the Lunacy Act. On paper, it was progress. It created a board of commissioners to inspect asylums, to standardize care, to protect patient rights. But inspections were rare, announced in advance, superficial. Superintendents scrubbed the walls, lined up the most docile patients, and rehearsed speeches. For a day, everything looked orderly. And when the commissioners left, the truth crept back in like mold. Still, the pressure grew. Journalists began investigating. Some went undercover. They posed as patients, faked symptoms, and entered asylums themselves. What they reported shocked the public, that many of the so-called insane were not ill at all. They were poor, or defiant, or simply inconvenient to someone in power. And while the public gasped, the machine kept humming. Because asylums served a purpose, one society had quietly come to rely on. Families could use them to get rid of unwanted relatives. Husbands could remove wives without consequence. The state could hide the visibly suffering from the streets. It was neat. It was quiet. It was profitable. Even reform-minded doctors struggled to make change. A few introduced music therapy, occupational work, better diets. Some opened the doors of their wards and let patients walk freely on the grounds, a revolutionary act at the time. But for every success, there were 10 more failures, 10 more places where nothing changed, because the system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as it had been designed, to confine, to silence, to remove. And though the reformers lit the first torches, they were still just flickers in a deep, institutional dark. If you stood outside a Victorian asylum and listened carefully, you might hear something unexpected. Not screams, not prayers. Laughter not from the patients, from the visitors. Because in the 19th century, asylums weren't just institutions. They were attractions. That's right. People bought tickets. Well-dressed families packed lunches and took day trips to see the mad. Not to help, not to volunteer, but to watch, to gawk, like it was theater, like the people inside were characters in some twisted performance. They peered through barred windows, strolling down the corridors like tourists in a zoo. Children pointed. Adults whispered. Attendants, eager to entertain, sometimes showcased their best exhibits, patients who screamed, who danced, who muttered to shadows. The most unusual were presented like trophies. Look at this one, the guide might say. He thinks he's a king. Or worse, she tried to seduce a priest. It didn't matter if any of it was true. What mattered was that it was entertaining. To be mad or even suspected of it was to lose all rights to dignity. You became an object, a cautionary tale, a curiosity. Some patients understood the game. They'd perform what people expected, madness. They'd act stranger, louder, more erratic. Not because they were ill, but because sometimes playing the part was safer than resisting. If you acted mad enough, maybe the show would end sooner. Maybe someone would feel sorry. Maybe. But the spectacle didn't stop at casual visitors. Doctors began staging demonstrations, public lectures where patients were brought out like live specimens. Case studies, they were called. Men and women paraded in front of medical students, donors, officials, forced to describe their thoughts. Or worse, forbidden to speak at all, spoken about, never to. Photographs followed. Early psychiatric photography was clinical, stark, and profoundly dehumanizing. Patients were dressed in their plainest clothes, often posed stiffly against blank walls. Their diagnoses, melancholia, mania, moral insanity, were scribbled below their faces. These images weren't meant for family albums. They were used in journals, textbooks, and exhibitions. The message was clear. Madness had a look, a posture, a type. If you resembled it, beware. And then came the stories, the fiction. Madness became a favorite tool in novels, plays, gossip. The madwoman in the attic, the cursed poet, the hysterical wife, always dangerous, always mysterious, rarely understood. Victorian literature turned real suffering into metaphor, into drama, into something just frightening enough to be thrilling but never real enough to be human. The irony, all this public exposure happened inside buildings that were supposed to offer sanctuary, supposed to shield the vulnerable from ridicule. But the asylum had become its own kind of theater, a place where the price of a ticket was paid not in coin but in shame. And the world kept coming, because seeing someone else's madness from the outside was a comfort. It reminded you that you were still on the right side of the bars, still free, still sane, at least for now. By the end of the 19th century, the asylum system was a paradox too big to ignore. It had begun with hope, or at least the illusion of it. Reformers had spoken of sanctuary. Lawmakers promised regulation. Architects drew up blueprints meant to reflect healing through order. And yet, behind the gates and garden walls, the truth was plain. The asylum was no longer a place to recover. It was a place to be erased. Those inside weren't just patients. They were problems. Poor, female, old, inconvenient. Diagnosed not by science but by discomfort. Removed not because they were dangerous but because they made others uneasy. And the longer they stayed, the easier it was to forget they had ever existed at all. Even into the early 20th century, the same structures persisted. Different words were used, more clinical, more modern, but the outcomes remained eerily familiar. Overcrowding, sedation, isolation, silence. The buildings once called havens became relics, massive, decaying institutions that loomed on the edge of towns like Gothic reminders of what society chose not to face. Some were converted into housing, some torn down, some abandoned completely, left to crumble with only wind and moss for company. But what about the people? Tens of thousands died in those wards, of disease, of neglect, of loneliness so heavy it suffocated. Their graves were often unmarked. Their records, if kept, reduced them to a diagnosis and a date. Never spoke again, prone to weeping, believed to be possessed. That was how history chose to remember them, if it remembered them at all. Yet their stories matter, because the asylum wasn't just a building, it was a mirror. It reflected what a society was unwilling to tolerate. Emotional pain, cognitive difference, grief that wouldn't heal on command, gender that wouldn't conform, people who wouldn't behave. And while we like to think we've come far with medication, therapy, awareness, shadows of that system remain. In underfunded mental health services, in prisons overcrowded with the untreated, in families too ashamed to speak openly, in every whispered sentence that begins, "We don't talk about him anymore." The Victorian asylum didn't simply contain madness, it reshaped it. It taught generations that being ill was something to be hidden, that suffering must be silent, that vulnerability was a threat. But it also taught something else, that what we choose to forget says just as much about us as what we choose to remember. Because buried beneath those stones and dust and records filed away in cold archives are not just the failures of a medical system, but the voices of people who once loved, cried, laughed, resisted, begged, dreamed. People who, for all their pain, deserved more than silence. And maybe that's the legacy worth holding on to. Not just the institutions, but the lives inside them.